I'm Doug Fern, and this is my take on music recording. Chuck Anderson is an amazing musician. Not only is his technique on guitar remarkable, he is also a solid businessman who has made his living from music since he was a teenager. Over his long career, Chuck has worked with the top singers in the music business. But his steady passion is teaching. Since he was 16, he has taught thousands of students. He instructs them not only on the technique of the guitar, but also how to pursue their musical dreams, whether it is becoming a rock star, a studio musician, or just playing for a lifetime of enjoyment. In addition, Chuck has written 26 books, the first when he was 21 years old. I first met Chuck in 1974 when we recorded his first jazz trio album. That was my introduction to the serious jazz idiom. Since then, we recorded a couple of other albums and recently did a session where Chuck recorded an entire album of wonderfully improvised compositions in 2 hours. It's called Spontaneity, and it will be available by the time you hear this. In July 2021, Chuck called me to ask if I had any photos from that first project we worked on, an album called Mirror Within a Mirror. I didn't, but after talking for a bit, we came up with the idea of recording a new album of solo guitar entirely improvised in the studio. Chuck came in late one Saturday afternoon in August, after a full day of teaching, and we produced the entire album in about 2 hours. Setup took minutes, and we were ready to record almost immediately. Chuck played his Gibson L5 guitar he has used all his life. I used an AEA R88 stereo ribbon mic on the Studio Vox AC30 amp with a pair of Coles 4038 ribbon mics farther out in the room. It sounded great right from the first note, so I never changed anything. There were no retakes, no punches, and no overdubs. The recording was done 24-bit, 96 kilohertz sample rate using DW Fern VT2 and VT24 mic preamps into a pair of VT4 equalizers on the main pickup, with a bit of bass roll-off to compensate for the close miking of the guitar amp. No other EQ or other processing was used. The session was recorded with Emerging Technologies Happy Converter using Pyramix software. During the mix, a bit of Bricasti M7 digital reverb was added. A week later, we recorded this interview using a pair of AEA R44 mics. For COVID safety reasons, we were well separated in the studio. In this wide-ranging conversation, Chuck talks about his career, his philosophy, and why he still works 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, teaching, composing, and exploring the world of music. I was really taken by the fact that you've made a living from music all your life. You've never worked for anybody as like an employee, really.
Correct.
Which I have a similar history in my own field. Talk about that a little bit, because I found that really interesting, because so few musicians have that career path.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. I don't know many people that would fall into that particular category, because it's so common early on, that you're bartending or waiting on tables or doing something until your break comes along or something, But to me, if I did that, that would be time that would be taken away from preparation to do the other. So then the only question is, can you get enough money to survive? Mm-hmm. And that was premised on working a lot, and I had a pretty strong business plan from early on. I do have a lot more, I think, awareness of marketing, business, and even the financial markets than most musicians that I know. And so it gave me a better perspective on business, you know. And so I had to just figure out what combination of things to put together. And the obvious combinations would be teaching was one, and obviously playing was another. So just those two. So I always, from early on, thought of what I did as a corporation that had multiple operating divisions. There would be the teaching division, the playing division, the writing division, and I would review from time to time which division needed more work. This one's strong and this one's a little weak, so better pump a little more effort into that. And I always thought that any time I spent outside of music was a disadvantage to me, So that was really all it was. But I remember how hard I had to work to put things together, because I do remember when I started teaching, I made the princely sum of $1.50 a lesson. It takes a lot of folk to get enough money to do whatever it is that you have to do. So
that's interesting. One other person that I knew, not real well, but our paths crossed multiple times, was Frank Zappa.
Oh, yeah.
Who was also a marketing major in college. And now when you look at it, you can see how he utilized what he learned there and how you applied that as well.
Yeah, and to show the parallel of coincidence, or the coincidence of parallel, I was a marketing major.
Yeah, I know that. That's amazing.
I didn't know that about Zappa, though.
Yeah. You had an early encounter with Wes Montgomery, which I think is just a fascinating story, because he's somebody we all look at as, a pioneer in so many ways.
I'll say.
Tell me about that encounter.
All right. That's one that I remember vividly. I know it was in the winter because it was cold and I had a coat. And my dad told me that Wes Montgomery was coming to Pep's Bar, which at the time, it was on Broad Street. I guess it was on North Broad. It was a jazz club. And he said Wes Montgomery was coming in town. Would I like to go see him? And I was 16. And I said, yeah, so we went over. But they wouldn't let us in because I was too young to go in. But I know we were standing outside the door, and my dad said, well, they won't let us in because you're underage. So he said, wait here. So I waited here, and he disappeared somewhere. I never did know where he disappeared to, but I am going to bet that there was some money exchanged hands, and Dad's gone now, and I never was able to ask him. Says, Dad, how did you pull that off? Anyway, so the guy comes back to the door, and he says to my father, he says, well, if you'll say he's your son, then you can come in. He says, well, he is my son. He said, well, then you can come in. He knew that in the beginning. So we went in, we sat at a table. The music at Pep's Bar was so strange. It was a big bar, no surprise, but there was a platform built above the bar. And the band was on the platform, which was about 8 steps up, like on a ladder. Now I realized they had a B3 organ up there. I don't know how they did that. Yeah. Mel Ryan was on drums, or not drums. Mel Ryan was organ, and Wes and a drummer as well. So anyway, so I sat at a table and they played, and I was of course fascinated by it. I had just bought his album, and he was my introduction to jazz guitar in particular. I bought the album. I listened to it quite a bit. So my dad excused himself. He said, get the men's room, be right back. Fine. So my coat dropped off my chair. Just, I guess I bumped it. And I turned around, leaned over, and picked up my coat. And I turned back around, and Wes was standing there. And I did a little double take, held out his hand. He said, hi, I'm Wes Montgomery. I understand you're a guitar player. I said, well, I'm trying to be a guitar player, 16. By then I had played for 2 years. I started at 14. So how far can you go in 2 years, right? And, we just talked briefly, and he said, would you mind if I sit down? And I said, no, so he sat down and he said, well, do you have any questions for me? And I said, well, I don't understand how you play your octaves. I said, do you pinch them or what do you do? And he said, no, wait there. So he goes up and he gets his Gibson L5 guitar, climbs down, comes over, sits down, hands me the guitar, and shows me how he plays octaves. So it is fair to say that I might be one of the relatively few people taught octaves by Wes Montgomery.
Wow.
And of course, that was a tremendous thing. And he told me, which impacted my life. He said, I've never really learned guitar and music the right way. It's all been by ear and feel and my brothers and experience and stuff like that. He said, I really feel that I've missed out by not learning more. So he said, make sure you learn as much as you can and try to become a teacher. And then you can, pass that on to other people. And I think that was a big influence in me teaching.
Yeah.
And going on from there.
Well, what always amazes me about you, Chuck, is you cram more stuff in a day than any 10 people I know.
That's true.
You've been doing it for so long and you haven't slowed down.
Yes. No, actually, I haven't slowed down at all. I know that sense of being organized to maximize what you do goes all the way back to me being in high school. And I came across, I think I put it in the book, a picture of a card that I found like 50 years later that showed my schedule for a Tuesday in February. And it had every 15 minutes scheduled from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed. And I followed it too. If it said 15 minutes on chords, 15 minutes on chords, 15 minutes on English, I think I may have given 30 minutes to my girlfriend at that time, long ago. And I followed that. And I've always felt that the efficient use of time is something that I needed to do. I'm not a big fan on wasting time. And because I've never really perceived my work as work, I've never really felt the need to not do it. Mm-hmm. I don't really feel, I've never felt any pressure in my work. I felt fatigue because of long days and long nights. But it never felt like pressure. And I always am surprised, but not surprised, when people talk so enthusiastically about their need for a vacation. And I basically say, so a vacation would do several things. One, it would cost me money, not good. Two, I would lose money, not good. And three, I would be forcing myself to do what I don't want to do. And so I'll just stay here, not spend the money, make the money, and do what I want to do. So that's my vacation stories.
Yeah, I have a similar attitude towards it. It probably doesn't surprise you.
Right.
That, when there is a day, a holiday or some day when there's nothing on my schedule, I look at the blank page and I say, this is great. I can do something really fun today.
That's right.
And then that lasts about an hour and a half.
That's right.
And then I say, what do I really want to be doing with my time? What I want to be doing with my time is what I do every day because I enjoy doing it. I love doing that stuff.
Exactly.
Whether it's recording or developing new products for the company or, writing something, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. It's when you say, I have the whole day off, and that lasts an hour. And then you go, well, yeah, so which means that I've got time to do what I can't do normally. Because sometimes, obviously, there's things that you'd like to do that you can't do because of other obligations. You know, there may be a design you're working on and you can't get at it because, you know, you had a full day of recording. So once your day is free, to me, that doesn't mean waste it. That means use it. And that's what I've always done.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it in sort of a cosmic way, time is all we've got. So
absolutely.
So we better use it wisely.
Exactly, and it ain't getting longer.
Right. Yeah. You know, the book that we keep referring to is called My Life in Music, and you gave me a copy of this recently, and I started reading it, and it's one of those few books where I almost read it cover to cover in one sitting. I fell asleep just because it was getting too late, so I had to pick it up again in the morning and continue reading it. But it's so interesting, so well done. And, you know, you and I have known each other for, close to 50 years now?
Yeah, the first recording we did was 47 years ago.
47 years.
That's the recording.
Yeah. Right. And yet I still learned a lot of very interesting things about you that I didn't know.
I'm glad. I'm going to get you another book that I wrote many years ago called Music Pursuing the Horizon. Mm-hmm. And it's a philosophical, psychological treatise of what people go through when they choose music. How do they feel? What happens with discouragement? How do you get over that and things like that? I wrote that book when I was 21.
Really?
Yeah, it's in multiple editions, but we'll send you. Make a note of that, Corinne. Pursuing the Horizon.
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty impressive the way you set a goal for yourself, figured out what worked and what didn't work, what you wanted to do and what you didn't want to do. There's a lot of people that are very talented out there. They have an innate ability to produce music, which is really good. But a lot of them lack the ability to make things happen, which, you know, to me is the downfall of the majority of people.
Agreed.
That are really good, but, you know, their career just never takes off.
Right.
And that might be okay, because I don't think there's anything wrong with people that just make music for fun.
Agreed.
And I think sometimes they actually have it better than those of us that deal with it for a living.
I have said that many times. I've done a lot of lectures in my life about some of these things. And one of the things that might be in the Horizon book that I say the most valuable participation in music is not scratching out a living, but making the music. And those, I've said in many cases, those people are far more valuable to the industry than people who play the music. You know, because first of all, people that play the music are not generally the people buying the records. They're not the people going to the concerts. Most musicians don't go to concerts on their days off, but people do, you know. And I think that it's also one of the greatest deterrents to Alzheimer's and to illness. I've got students in their 80s, 90s, and 100s.
No kidding.
Today.
Wow.
Yeah. I just produced an album for this guy who's 103 years old. He wrote lyrics. He always wanted to make an album. So he enlisted one of my junior students, he's only 90, to write music, which he had never done. So he asked me to help him learn how to do that. I did. And we recorded an album called the Senior Songbook. And it was the music, it said the music of the 30s and 40s with lyrics from today. So the lyrics are exclusively about seniors or super seniors. And some of them are funny, some of them are touching, you know. But the band, you know, was many people in it had never been in a studio before. We had people, I guess the youngsters were maybe 68. They were the really young guys. You know, I think we had a drummer that was 85, maybe. Piano player was 90, etc. And the album was so successful. It's just because it's such a story. A guy at 103 wants to do an album and start a record label. And that's what he did.
Good for him. That's wonderful.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
And it had so much publicity. They had radio stations and TV stations coming from Brazil to do that. And the amount of publicity they got was phenomenal. Sold out the first batch, sold out the second batch. Unfortunately, the gentleman that started just passed away just recently in a terrible circumstance. They took him into the hospital for observation, sent him home with COVID, and he dies Christmas Eve, which is just a tragedy.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But anyways,
his career was just beginning.
Exactly. I've said that to people many times. And who else was it? Was it El Di Meola? Yeah. El Di Meola was having dinner with one of my long-term students. Di Meola said that the student told him something that I had said, that he said public. He says, the greatest thing I ever heard. He says, this guy, which is me, said, it's the only business you could start at 60 and have a 30-year career. You know? But I'm a big believer in the involvement of music on all levels. I don't have any standards that the students need to follow, like, you need to be a professional, you need to audition. I don't have any of those things. It's just, do you want to make music? And if you do, I'll show you how to do that. And I don't care if it's bluegrass or folk or country or writing or music business. And I have students in all of those categories.
Talk a little bit about how you got where you are. Because, it just didn't happen overnight. And I'm sure there were some false starts going in a direction you decided was probably not ideal. Talk about that a little bit. I think it's really interesting. And maybe even though we're talking about the 60s now, I think a lot of those things are unchanging. They still apply today.
Oh, I think they absolutely would apply to today, because you're still doing the same thing. You're still creating music, and you still have to do something with it, either for your own sake or to derive an income one way or another. Well, I think kind of the answer to that would be, unlike a lot of people, I felt I was ready to play long before I was ready to play. At age 14, I had learned, 6 chords or something. And so what did I do? Joined a band. And you say, well, what did you play? I said, we played songs that had those 6 chords in it. I said, we passed over many songs that I couldn't play because I couldn't play a bar chord or I couldn't play a more complex chord. So we did that right off the bat. So I was actually in a band within 3 months of touching the guitar. And of course, I first got involved with the guitar by complete accident. I was very much into sports. I was deeply into basketball and later into martial arts. One day, very young, I had sprained my ankle on the basketball court and couldn't play. And a neighbor had given me a guitar, which I had no interest in, and put it under the bed. But I hurt my ankle and I couldn't play basketball, so I said, so I'll drag out the guitar. He'd written chords on little pink sheets of paper. I hit the first chord, which was E minor, which guitar players will recognize as the easiest chord that exists in music. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I hit that chord, music went up, sports went down, weight went up immediately. So that was the beginning of knowing how interested I was in it. So it's not an accident that I started playing, and many people would have said, I'm not ready to do this. But I said, yeah, I'm ready to do this. I'm not ready to do hard stuff, but I'm ready to do easy stuff. And then 2 years later, when I was 16, a neighbor came down, showed my mother an article that was written by a woman who had polio. And she said that she was looking for a guitar teacher for her 12-year-old son. And I looked at it. There was a phone number. I started to call. My mom grabbed the phone from me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm calling this woman." She said, "What for?" "Because I'm going to teach her son." And she said, "You're 16. You don't know how to teach." And apparently she said that my answer was, "I know exactly how to teach." And with that commitment, she handed me the phone. I called the woman. We arranged the first lesson, and I didn't drive yet, so my mom drove me to their house for me to teach the boy. And the first student was in Wayne, Pennsylvania, on Pugh Road. And so I began to do that. It went very well. And then it started to spread and to different neighborhoods. And I taught more and more people, always traveling to the home. Then it occurred to me that this was kind of inefficient. So I got, I started working at a very small music store in Wayne. And it went well, except for the fact that the music store went out of the business. So I had no place to teach. So my parents graciously offered their TV room to me to be my studio. So that was my studio for quite a while. Then from 16 to about 19. And then at 19, my dad got transferred to Texas. And so I lost my studio. So I went to Medley Music, which we all remember. From many years ago, and basically negotiated an opportunity to teach there. I had a lot going for me because I had a fairly sizable clientele. I said, "Well, I'll bring all my students." So the negotiation, "Well, that'd be great." I said, "Since I'm bringing the students, I should get a higher percentage." And I got Harry Rosenblum to agree. And I became a teacher at Medley. And within, I think, 2 years, I had been appointed director of the school, and I was there from age 19 to age 28. This is all the teaching side of it. And then I decided that I wanted to get my own place, and so I got a place in Berwyn, Pennsylvania, and opened Modern Music Studios, which was my school, and that became very successful. We had 12 teachers, over 400 students. We had our own parking lot. We had our own guitar repair shop. We had a publishing company, and all of that stuff. And I was 28 then, and then I stayed there for 8 years total, 5 years in one facility and 3 in another. And at that point, I decided to build a studio in the house that I was living in Conshohocken, and it was built on the back of it as an addition. And that's the studio I'm in still today after all those years. In fact, that's the studio I just came from to come here. And it's been a very successful practice throughout the years. And as I teach people that I enjoy, but I don't insist on what type of music, they go for. And of course, then sometime after that, long before the internet started, I was doing correspondence guitar lessons from here to Europe. That was tedious. Write a lesson, mail it, wait for the mail. It was a mess. But anyway, it was the forerunner of the internet to a degree. One time I went down to Texas, and they knew that this East Coast guitar player was visiting Paris, Texas. So the local store asked if I would come in and tell the students about the music business. So I said, sure. So I came in and we talked a little bit about it. And one of the things that they said is it would be great if I would come there to teach. Well, the likelihood of me giving up the East Coast for Paris, Texas was pretty low, But I did say, which I thought was kind of interesting, I said, well, I can't do that. The parents came to me and offered me a salary to relocate to teach their children, which was very sweet, and I couldn't do it. But I did say, someday there will be a way for me to teach you, and I will be there and you will be here. And now that day is here, because that's the internet teaching. which
Right.
I do now. And then gradually I went into the internet teaching, which allowed me to expand to Europe and Canada and every place else. And so I'll have a student from Paris, and the next student will be in person, and the next one will be in Oklahoma, then Colorado, and that's what I do all day and all night. So,
Wow.
so now that's just the teaching side of it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so then the playing side of it was just a matter of, taking steps, starting with the band that did, seventh grade dances, and then moving up to high school proms, and moving up and getting up to bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and everything else. And then, of course, eventually at age 21, I had the opportunity through a remarkable set of circumstances to become staff guitar at the Latin Casino. The coincidence of it was beyond imagination. But what happened was I was living in Bryn Mawr at the time and just doing the teaching and the little jobs, had the Volkswagen McDonald's bags in the back, which I ate on the way to the jobs, And one day the phone rang, and it was the Latin Casino. It was a Monday. And they said, we need a guitar player. Could you do 2 weeks here? I said, yeah, I can do 2 weeks there. So I said, well, when does the show start? They said, tonight. I was in Bryn Mawr, and this was in Cherry Hill. It was about 4 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I said, well, when's the rehearsal? They said, you already missed it. It was at 1 o'clock. I said, oh, no. So I said, all right. I said, I'll do it. So I jumped in the car. I'm shaving, cutting my face, trying to get a tuxedo on. I'm driving over the bridge. So I get in there. And so my first major show had to be sight read with thousands of people staring at me and top musicians and all. So it was kind of frightening. As it turns out, it went good. It was an Israeli star named Elisa Kashi, who was a big star in Israel. Anyway, it went well. She liked me, apparently, said some flattering things about me to the guy who booked the musicians. So Joe Lano was the guitarist there. Joe was a brilliant guitar player, a student of Sandoli's, way ahead of me. He'd been studying for a long time. He was a brilliant player. There's no way I was ever going to get that job. No possible way. So turns out that the reason they needed a guitar player is because Joe got a chance to go to Vegas and to play a 2-week show. He could do that by giving notice for those 2 weeks. And then it was because they had a show coming in that didn't need a guitar player. But Elisa Kashi's people fired their guitar player at the airport on the way to the show. So they expected to use the Latin's guitar player. But they had released him.
Yeah.
There was no Latin player. So the guy called every guitar player he knew. Busy. Finally, he got to the last name on the list, which was Chuck Anderson. Everybody said, anybody know this guy? Everybody said, no. He says, well, we're stuck. So he called me, and that's how I came in. So I was there for 2 weeks, and when the show ended, I went in to get paid, and the contractor said, Elisa said a lot of nice things about you. I said, oh, that's nice. I appreciate it. I said, really, I enjoyed the show, and if you ever need anybody else to bail you out, just give me a call. So I was sitting there, and just then the phone rang, and it was Joe Lano calling from Vegas to tell Lou Krause that, hey, Lou, I've got an offer in the Flamingo here, and I'm not coming back. And so now they were stuck because they didn't have a guitar player. So turns out that they had me, and just as that happened, I was standing in the office, and the contractor said to Joe, well, I can't believe you're not coming back. He says, now what are we going to do? Or something like that. He turned from the phone. He held his hand over the phone. He said to me, who was sitting there waiting for a check, he said, would you like to be staff guitar here? I said, yeah. And that was it. For the next 4 years, I played 14 shows a week and 1 rehearsal a week. And that went on until I saw the writing on the wall and knew the Latin was headed south. And I exited after that. So that's my story of the Latin.
Mention some of the people that you backed up during that time. That's pretty impressive.
List. It's a list. Let me see. But Corinne may even help me on this. Well, Bobby Darin was there, Michelle Legrand, Peggy Lee, Billy Eckstein. I did the Lawrence Welk Show, Trini Lopez, Raquel Welch, the bombshells over there. Did a lot of comedians. Every comedian I can think of, from Johnny Carson to Bob Hope to Shecky Greene. And I imagine there's a list in the book that would do a heck of a better job than I am.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, there's a lot of them, and I can't remember all of them. Mitzi Gaynor was one of them. Well, of course, Joey Heatherton.
Let me see a couple of these in the book that you Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet.
Yes.
Engelbert Humperdinck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joey Bishop.
Yep.
Liberace.
Yes.
Connie Francis, Frankie Avalon.
Right.
Perry Como, Patty Page.
Right.
Sammy Davis Jr.
Yep.
Debbie Reynolds.
Yes.
I mean, it's an amazing list.
Suzanne Summers was there.
Yep. Vicky Carr, Jerry Lewis.
Right.
Joey Heatherton.
Yeah, I did David Brenner's first show at the Latin when he was a fledgling comedian.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long, long list. It's pretty impressive. So did you consider that part of your education as, playing these charts? I mean, this was all written out stuff, right?
Yes, frighteningly, yes, it was. Yeah, I think one of the strangest things about me as a 16-year-old guitar player, and I can't tell you why, it was not my goal to be a star. It was not my goal to be famous. It was my goal to be an accompanist. Mm-hmm. At 16, I knew I wanted to accompany singers. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's what happened there. That's what happened in the 7 years I was at Valley Forge Music Fair. Mm-hmm. And the Schubert Theater and the Forest Theater and everything else. And I just found it fascinating to play and contribute to singers.
Yeah.
So, I can't tell you why, particularly. Most people would, try to be, rock and roll heroes, but not me.
So basically, those kinds of gigs, you've got a chart that somebody has written out. Is that note for note? Do you have any flexibility in that at all?
It's a great question. You have flexibility if you're good enough to employ that flexibility to do something they liked. And if not, no, you had no flexibility. Play what's written.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the big thing about that is, which is a kind of a career thing, the great danger and great fear of that work is not the shows. It's not the stars. It's the rehearsal. The first rehearsal. You've never seen the music, and you don't know how much of an annoyance the conductor is, who may have had a bad flight, and he's not taking well to anything that goes wrong. And so you had to really deal with that, because what most people don't know, musicians at rehearsal get fired. At the rehearsal. And it's one of the most difficult things to cope with. Fortunately, I never dealt with it, but I saw many people that did. And it would be maybe the bass player was playing, and maybe the artist didn't like the bass player for whatever reason. So he went to the conductor and said, "Get rid of this bass player." And he would go to the music contractor and said, "Bass player's out." And the poor bass player would have to pack up and walk out in front of the whole orchestra. And then what happened next? There's another bass player coming right down the aisle, sitting in and playing. Those things happen a little more than you would think. Once you got past the rehearsal and you're in the show, now they couldn't fire you. You just had to survive rehearsal.
That's pretty brutal.
It was very difficult. It was hard for me to watch it happen to people. I mean, you just feel terrible because a lot of times it was for something, I don't know, something stupid. They might have said something to the conductor that the conductor didn't like and didn't want to deal with them. And, I remember one poor young piano player got axed when he said he was claiming that the notation was incorrect, that the symbol was wrong. So the idiot, young kid, stands up at rehearsal and says to the conductor, "These notations are wrong. Who did these charts?" Conductor said, "I did." So next thing you knew, so that wouldn't have been his playing. There's a lot of ways to go wrong.
Yeah. Well, that's a really different discipline than the life most musicians lead.
It is very different.
And it's a whole other aspect of the music business that relatively few people do that.
But then it's absolutely true. It was like the reading side of session players, because of course session players are a unique bunch as well, with all the Wrecking Crew and the people in Motown and Muscle Shoals and all. In many cases, they were not necessarily readers. They had a great feel. Some were, and of course, if you had to do sessions for film, you had to read. But they were in many cases well-trained jazz musicians making a ton of money in rock and roll.
Yeah, I always found it fascinating that almost everybody on those, gigantic session groups, the ones that had that huge success, they were all jazz players.
All of them were jazz players.
They weren't playing jazz.
They weren't playing jazz, but they were versatile enough and good enough musicians and smart enough to see that. And what many of them would do, Hank Garland was an example. Hank Garland was a brilliant jazz player, but he was the #1 session on-call guy in Nashville. He made a fortune. And he played country music in the studios during the week, and then he drove to Chicago and played jazz on the weekends. Yeah. So they often did do that. They went and played jazz, but they weren't playing jazz in the studios.
Right. Yeah, I think I read about the Motown guys were the same way.
The Funk Brothers.
Funk Brothers, yeah.
Yeah, one of my students, somebody that I trained, is the one who did that documentary.
Oh, right.
And wrote the book Standing in the Shadows of Motown.
Right.
And I believe he won a couple Academy Awards for it.
Yeah. No, that was a great documentary. And I know him too, and his name is escaping me.
Alan Slutsky.
Yeah, that's it. Al Slutsky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody who's lasted in the business has a kind of a really interesting story, and almost always quite different. Right. Where I was the big show player. I think I was also, I think a lot of guitar players had trouble with me because I had all the shows, and they felt that was not quite right to do.
Well, at that point in your career, was that something you considered as, a long-term thing, or was that just an intermediate thing for you?
Well, it's a great question, because going back a little bit, when I finished with the Latin, this is a characteristic I very rarely told anybody ever, but a characteristic of my career was I did something as long as I loved it. And as soon as I didn't love it, I hated it. And as soon as I hated it, I had to have the guts to leave it, no matter what the financial cost was, So I got that after 4 years at the Latin, and I decided that I wanted to start my own jazz trio, consisting of Al Stauffer and Ray Dealey. And that's the trio that we came to your studio to do the first album, Mirror Within a Mirror. And we went on for about 4 to 5 years, did a lot of concerts, and we never did a second album. We just did a first one. And that was a vinyl album. And then I got to the point that somebody asked me would I consider coming back and doing the work at Valley Forge. And since the jazz stuff, wasn't making a ton of money, and that was the opportunity, and the guys had their own kind of going their ways too. So I took that and stayed there, for another 7 years. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of that, I started feeling, at the end of it, not the middle, the end of it, I started feeling the anger come up again. Mm-hmm. And I remember one day, the last day, I went into the pit, and a bass player was there, and he looked at me, and I looked intense. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And I go, "I don't know, but you won't see me again." And I resigned that night. And then that's when I went into Neo. And I spent 7 years doing that, concerts, and we recorded something together and all that. So that was the Neo period. And then there was this. And then from there, I went into production, and I owned a music production company, and I turned all my attention to writing. And I had never written before the trio. So I turned my attention to writing and started writing for TV and radio and film. And I ran that company for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so I was doing everything from McDonald's to I don't know what. And a lot of variety and versatility there. And eventually I got to the same point of that, and I stopped that, and then I went on to the next thing. The constant in my life has been teaching. Yeah. That's the constant. That's the one I would never give up. I had offers from L.A. to move there to do film scores. It was the only time I was ever tempted to do it, but eventually I said, I don't think I'm an L.A. kind of guy. Mm-hmm. There's too much schmoozing going on over there, and I'm not much of a schmoozer. I can do it, but I find it intensely distasteful. And that's a problem in commercial music, because you do, most of them do so much partying together, and I could never tolerate that. Yeah. So I think Creed and I laughingly say we are the only couple that has never drank, smoked, did a drug, or had coffee.
You'll have to include me in that group.
Oh, all right then.
Yeah.
3. We're up to 3. How about that?
Our conversation will continue in the next episode, where we discussed his early albums, the beauty of silence, and some practical advice for people who want to make a living in music. You can learn more about Chuck Anderson at his website, chuckandersonjazzguitar.com. That's all one word. There you will find interesting information, samples of his music, and links to his social media. Thanks for listening, and please subscribe to this podcast using any of the many podcast providers that carry it. Your subscription helps others find my podcast. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome, and feel free to send me your ideas about future episodes. You can reach me at dwfern@dwfern.com. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.